I've written a novel. It's called The Island, and islands have always obsessed me ever since I was a child. I actually created one in a pond and then stood on it for quite most of the day with a little bridge. Anyway, this is it. Well, I'll read you the blurb first. When Peterson is offered the job of caretaker on a remote island, he can't believe his luck. What appeals to him most is that he will be completely alone. After a few weeks on the island, however, he begins to sense that something is not right. Unable to put his finger on it, the isolation he has longed for begins to turn sour. A chance discovery of a book about the island's history raises yet more questions, but in it too there seem to be clues, answers perhaps, as to what is going on around him. So that gives you a rough idea where we're going. So there is essentially just one character in this book, which is quite a challenge to write, and it's in the third person. Peterson sat up straight and pushed back the bed covers. For a moment he held his breath and listened to the sound of the sea breaking on the rocks. Every so often there was a thumping reverberation, signifying when a bigger wave had hit the shoreline. A minute or two earlier, however, he thought he had heard something else. Lasting no more than 5 seconds, it had come across like a groan, as if the person, or indeed animal, had been in considerable pain. The only thing he could be certain of was that it had been outside his room. He waited, staring into the darkness, his hands resting on the bedsheets. Every part of him was listening, straining, alert like a hare in an open field. But there was nothing. The house was silent. Then he became aware of the gentle ticking of the clock beside him. For some reason, it reminded him of a small bird, like a sparrow, hopping over the ground and pecking as it went. As he followed its rhythm, his senses retreated inwards to the pulsing beat of his heart. Tap, tap, pump, pump. 2 repetitions, fractionally out of step with each other. And of course, there was the sea coming in too. In truth, there was no silence at all, and there never would be. As if to assert itself, his heartbeat grew louder, stronger, travelling up to the crown of his head. The echo of it throbbed through his ears. He wished he could quieten its effect, smother it even. At least then he would hear better were the sound to come a second time. He rubbed at his eyes with the curled-up shape of his knuckles. What if the noise had been something altogether different, as weightless as a shadow? With barely a speck of light in the room, the question was an instinctive one. Indeed, when he thought about it more, the ghostly entity he had in mind seemed hard to resist. He tried to imagine it now, a vague, spectral shift of the night's air, or maybe a half-glimpsed being crossing the landing before vanishing without trace. Had this been the source of the groaning sound? He paused and took in a deep breath. When he then released it, his mind was less convinced. Was it not more likely that the darkness was interfering with his ability to reason? In the light of the new day, he would be able to confirm what was there and what was not. Until then, it was better he thought of nothing. Peterson made an attempt to speak, no more than a few words, to drive back the darkness and its dismal influence. But before he could say anything, a run of images suddenly flashed through him. He was surprised to see that they were mostly of an animal lying wounded in the middle of a road. There seemed no explanation for it. Perhaps there wasn't one. As random as a bird flying in through an open window. Turning his attention to it now, he saw that on either side of the road where the unfortunate beast lay, stood a number of tall, thin pine trees, stretching away into the distance. Their trunks were as straight as pencils. It seemed the creature, which bit by bit began to materialize into a baby deer, had been struck by a car. It was all mangled up, intestines spilling out onto the black asphalt. It had been left to live its last few minutes in unmitigated agony. The deer feebly pushed out its pink tongue, closed its eyes and groaned. Was that the sound he had heard a few moments ago? Had the dying deer and the groan all been part of a dream he'd had, and the visualization simply a recollection of it? Was that it? Or perhaps he was still dreaming, and the poor deer in the road was the final strand of it, filtering through into his slowly waking mind. He sighed and let his head fall back into the pillow. Peterson knew this was not the first time he had heard the noise. If his memory was right, he'd heard it no less than 5 times since moving into the house a couple of months ago. Always it had occurred at night, or to be more precise, in the very early hours of the morning, when little more than a hint of light was in the sky. At first he had dismissed it as something foolish going on in his head, linked perhaps to a distant memory, or, in much the way he was thinking now, tied up with the end of a disturbing dream. It was his belief that his new surroundings, especially with it being an island, were having an impact on him, but that in time it would soon fade. Then one night, he'd been lying awake, at least he thought he had, eyes open too, when he'd heard the sound again. Not only this, but it seemed as if some words were audible, something like a disconsolate, "Oh no." He couldn't be sure, especially as he didn't even know for certain if he'd been awake or not. That was the problem. There were just too many unknowns for him to get to the bottom of it. Too many times when all he could think of saying was, "What the hell was that?" As the days and nights went by, he found that the more he dwelt on it, pondering what it could be, that he became irritable. He kept asking questions that he knew perfectly well had no answers, at least not while he was there with no one to speak to say, "Did you hear that too?" Then at least the problem would have been shared, 2 heads debating the sound's most likely cause. On his own, the unanswered questions had an eerie echo to them, sometimes coming back louder and more persistent than before. He would find himself getting nervous and jittery about living alone in the house. He would go into each of the rooms, his eyes roaming the walls, searching for the something he did not know. Other times he would fling open the front door and just stand there on the step, letting the view of the distant sea wash over him. Usually there was a breeze too, and this would run into his face, filling his nostrils with the small, salty smell of the sea. He imagined it cleansing his mind, purging it of any unnecessary tensions. One of the things that worried him on the island was that if it became known he wasn't coping with the isolation, then his stay there might be terminated early. This was only a guess, but a reasonable one, he thought, for the owners might feel he was no longer able to carry out the duties expected of him, even though there weren't that many to speak of. He saw, therefore, that he needed to pull himself together. Most of all, he had to try and stop posing all the questions to himself. His first attempts at this were not that successful, resorting mainly to interrupting himself with a few stern words. "Just get on with it. You can do better than this." But they did at least give him grounds for hope. He believed that if he worked at it more, in time he'd be able to control his feelings better. The island, of course, was an unpredictable environment, one he certainly had no hope of influencing. It would be closer to the truth to say that he was at its mercy, particularly the sudden changes in the weather. Sometimes he would see it turn in a matter of seconds, or it would creep over the island with the stealth of a leopard, the warmth in the air disappearing so slowly it took him a while to realize he was cold again. About 3 weeks ago, Peterson recalled how a heavy mist had started to appear over the cliffs just as the evenings were drawing in. It moved without a sound, and yet such was its sweep, there was something fearsome about it too. Perhaps it was simply a sign that the season was changing. After all, it was near the end of May, or the temperatures in the sea had mysteriously dropped. Peterson had little knowledge about these things. He could only watch, usually from upstairs through the spare bedroom window. As the mist continued to thicken and spread, he observed how it mixed with the shadows of the dusk, in places resembling the black smoke of a bonfire, and he was fascinated by the vague and immaterial shapes that came and went. It was whilst he was following these strange fluctuations that he had occasionally seen what looked to be figures emerging from its hazy gloom. They were of giant-like proportions, and as they broke free from the bulk of the mist, there was something almost casual about the way they slid across the grasslands, before then disappearing into nothingness a minute or so later. Other times he saw what he thought were creatures, herds of cattle perhaps, but much bigger, grazing, pushing eastwards, and again these too would suddenly dematerialize in front of his eyes. Of course, he knew what he had seen was merely the way the mist was coming apart as it moved over the island. He knew all this, and yet still he couldn't resist associating them with the noises he'd heard at night. Against his better judgment, you could say, he then started wondering if the island, and the house too, might not in some way be haunted. Such speculations irritated him greatly, particularly the ease with which they came to him, demonstrating in his eyes how vulnerable he was to the solitary conditions of the island. It was not as if he hadn't known he would be the only one there. In fact, he had been made aware of this some weeks before his arrival, and besides, it had been the very thing that had led him to apply for the position in the first place. So for him to have fallen prey to these subjective, if not imaginary fears, when he really should have felt very safe, especially since the mainland was some 17 miles away and no other islands in between, meaning an encounter from an unwanted intruder was extremely unlikely, seemed irrational, even stupid. Naturally, he told himself that it was all in his head. The evidence clearly said as much, and that instead he should focus more on the island as he had seen and loved it during the first couple of weeks of his stay. Then the beauty of its isolation had enthralled him to such a degree that he often wanted to pinch himself. It had just seemed too magical to be real. Peterson pushed the bed covers back a bit further, then swung his legs out, dropping his feet onto the bare wooden floor. It was 3:30 in the morning. He stood up and went over to the window and drew the curtains aside. The moon was just then emerging from behind a cloud, casting a silver glow across the surface of the sea. In the foreground, just a few yards in the front of the house, were the silhouettes of 2 pine trees. They were usually the first things he'd see when standing there by the window. "I wonder how long they've been there," he whispered, over a protracted yawn. "At least a few decades. After all, they were taller than the highest point of the house." He peered at the outer tips of the branches and saw that they were barely moving, which meant, of course, only a light breeze was coming off the sea. Such stillness was a rare occurrence. Mostly the wind arrived with a rush and haste, and often some strength behind it too. Unhindered by the open expanse of water, it could do pretty much as it wanted, slamming against the walls of the house and rocking the 2 trees back and forth, as if they were little more than rag dolls. It was a wonder to him that they were still standing after all these years. His attention was then drawn to the gate leading to the house, and the long grass growing around it. In the paltry light of the moon, the grass and the gate appeared in various shades of grey. It made him think he was watching a black and white movie. Just then, the grass quivered under the influence of a passing pocket of air. An uncertain smile moved over his face. Returning to the bed, Peterson sat down and yawned a second time. Then he spoke. That sound again. He liked to hear his voice, even if there was no one to hear it but himself. He found a comfort in it. Sometimes he could almost fool himself into thinking he had a companion sitting there beside him. He cleared his throat noisily. For a moment, he thought of going downstairs to see if he could find a possible source of the noise that had woken him. He could check all the rooms, the cupboards too, even go down into the cellar with a torch and a stick in his hand. But no sooner had he thought this than he dismissed the idea, just as he had done every time before. After all, what could be gained by such an investigation? If, as was most likely, he discovered nothing, would it not prompt another question, feed again into the narrative of there being an otherworldly presence in the house? Not only this, but if by some remote chance it was proved right, that there was something ghostly, then would it not be better if he left it alone? For thus far, other than a few faint noises, he could not say it had done anything much. In a few weeks' time, there was a good chance he would get used to it, sleep right through it even, as if it was as harmless as the buzzing of a fly on a windowsill. Yes, let's hope so, he whispered, and before he knew it, he had yawned again. In all likelihood, he surmised, there was a perfectly reasonable explanation for the noises. For instance, when there was a gale blowing, the wind would make the timbers of the house strain and creak, and that this could therefore be a cause for some of the times he'd heard it. Though, of course, it didn't make sense of what he'd just woken up to, for as he had just observed through the window, the air was barely moving, as good as motionless. He shook his head and glanced down at his pale hands, thinking to himself that he shouldn't spend so much time going over the matter. It was not healthy to be obsessing over it, particularly when no answers were likely to be forthcoming. He nodded and thought that might be the end of the matter, and it probably would have been had he not bent down and ran his fingers over the wooden floor under his feet. He was searching for the fire poker. He had often brought it with him to the bedroom. It made him feel safer to know it was there. Seconds later, and his fingers encountered the coolness of the steel, and so he picked it up and held it in front of him, observing the subdued gleam on its surface. The end was as sharp as a spear, a useful thing to have at one's disposal, he thought. An anxious smirk then flickered across his face before he returned the poker to its place under the bed. He realized he had little idea what he'd actually do with it, were he to encounter something or somebody in the house. Perhaps then it was simply a symbolic gesture. That's chapter 1.